Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing today? First, thanks for joining us today. I know a lot of us here in southern New Jersey, as well as other parts of the country, have been dealing with some wild weather this past week, especially with some tornadoes in southern New Jersey. So I hope everyone's safe and well. But with that, welcome to our latest webinar. My name is Jonathan Beach, and I am the DOT FAA Dedicated Solution Architect. Today, as with all of our webinars, we have another great one today, and we're centering this one around zero trust. With the White House's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, zero trust has become an extremely popular way of thinking lately. But before we get started, before we get there, my ground rules, right? So by default, we can't see you. Your cameras are turned off. Your mics are turned off as well. You can't ask questions verbally. With that, we encourage questions. So on your right-hand side of your screen, you should see a section that says Q&A. Drop your question in there. During the presentation, myself as well as others monitoring the call, we will try to answer those questions. If we can't, our presenter today will take a pause throughout the presentation and we'll ask him the questions at that time. Also, there is a chat section, right? So I don't want the questions in the chat section. But if you guys want to tell us what a great job we're doing, if you can't hear us, if we need to enlarge the screen or anything, please just drop a question or a comment in that chat section. Jeff Thompson will be joining us shortly. He's stuck in another appointment, but like I said, we'll be monitoring the presentation throughout. I will also be putting things in that chat section, including my email address. At any time before or after this call, this webinar, if you have a question and you want to reach out, feel free to always ping my email address. So you guys didn't come here to see me talk, so let's get started. So today I welcome Kenny Peoples to the webinar. So he's a cybersecurity architect here at Red Hat. He has an extensive background with the Department of Defense, but I'll let Kenny introduce himself. So Kenny, welcome to the FAA.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to our Alter Traditional Thinking to Prioritize Zero Trust webinar. I'm a Red Hat security architect, mainly in DoD and intelligence community. I've worked on different customer engagements for Red Hat to provide solutions based on Red Hat and non-Red Hat products and technologies. I was previously a Red Hat global evangelist for the middleware business unit, and I have a bachelor's, master's, and trying to get my doctorate. So please feel free to stop me at any point on the questions, and I'll make sure to answer. But of course, if there is something that I don't know right off or we can't answer in the webinar, we certainly will make sure that we get the answer back to you. All right, first I have to be on the screen. So the term zero trust, you will see it a lot now with the executive order and security product marketing. In short, implicit trust is removed from all computing infrastructure, and said trust levels are explicit and continuously calculated and adopted to allow the just-in-time, just enough access to enterprise resources. So during the webinar, I want to make sure that we cover some different topics and can provide some recommendations to start with to move forward with a zero trust adoption. And you may already have some of the components that you're moving forward with, but hopefully with the webinar today, you'll be able to think about some of the goals that need to be obtained. So we'll do an overview of zero trust. We'll talk about some challenges and talk about the zero trust maturity and capability model, a Red Hat product mapping, which is important, a path forward summary, and of course, question and answer. So the executive order has really picked up the zero trust discussions and reference architectures and guides, best practices, so forth. Of course, that was issued on May 12th, and there are multiple agencies, including NIST, that are directed to enhance cybersecurity. So the executive order, of course, helps move the federal government to the secure cloud services and, of course, zero trust architecture, which we are discussing. So our main goals should be to increase the adoption of security best practices, which include employing the zero trust security model, and accelerate movement to the secure cloud services. And that will include using security tools such as multi-factor authentication, encryption, etc. So from the executive order, there were 7 main topics that are found described in the White House fact sheet. Of course, today we're dealing with the second bullet point, to modernize and implement stronger cybersecurity standards in the federal government. And there are other topics in the executive order that are important, like the SBOM, secure supply chain, critical software, incident response playbook, etc. Those may be topics that can be done in future webinars. Of course, there are multiple agencies involved in the executive order deliverables. For instance, CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, led the development of the Cloud Security Technical Reference Architecture, and that's in accordance with Section 3C2 of the executive order, and the TRA will be a guide to help agencies leverage the migration to cloud security. And that TRA is available at OMB Max, and I can provide a link to that as well. I can make sure I put it, I don't think I've put it in the presentation, but I can put that in the presentation in case you're interested in getting to that. And then Section 4 of the executive order directs NIST to enhance the software supply chain security. And there are guidelines that are supposed to include criteria to evaluate the software security, to evaluate the security practices of the developers and suppliers, which also include Red Hat, of course, innovative tools or methods to demonstrate conformance with secure practices. So let's take a second to look at what is zero trust. So the fluff, or bottom line up front, it's not a style, not a thing. Each customer will implement zero trust in different ways, and maturity models will differ with them. And it's based on principles and assumptions about trust that we'll talk about. And the main principle, assume all interactions are already compromised unless proven otherwise. So the main concept that we want to take away with zero trust is there is no implicit trust, but deny all as default. And so as the slide indicates, there's no traditional network edge, and we always want to identify DAS, which is the data, assets, applications, and services. So from the executive order, the definition for zero trust architecture, a security model, set of design principles, and coordinated cybersecurity and system management strategy. And it's based on acknowledgement of threats that exist both inside and outside the traditional network boundary. So what is the history behind zero trust, and what is the impact now? So if we look at this historical timeline, zero trust is not new. It goes back to 2004 with Jericho Forum deparameterization, and then 2009 Forrester coining zero trust. 2014 Google publishing Beyond Core, etc. So with the executive order, it's not trying to guide people to use something new. It's a directive to make sure everyone is moving forward with the requirement of implementing zero trust architecture. So when we look at section 3B, because there are different mentions in the executive order, and in 3B talks about 60 days to the head of each agency to develop a plan to implement zero trust architecture. And then another reference is also in section 3C, which is to facilitate the migration to cloud technology adopting zero trust architecture. So within the executive order, there are multiple mentions of zero trust architecture. Okay, so let's touch on some different documents that are, of course, online that define zero trust, what capabilities are supposed to be used for zero trust, what tenants are. There's different references. For instance, the NIST Special Publication 207, 800-207 for zero trust architecture, the DISA zero trust reference architecture, the CISA cloud security technical reference, etc. And one of my favorite cartoons, which is on the bottom right, of course, is the MFA graphic. Because when I try this at home, I get a you're such a nerd look with doing the multi-factor authentication at home with the kids. But so let's highlight some of the tenets of zero trust that's defined in the special publication. And I believe that that special publication will get an update as well. So the 7 tenets defined in the special publication describes what should be involved with zero trust rather than what should be excluded. So the ideal goals are attempts at being the vendor technology agnostic. And so within that special publication, it also defines zero trust network. So to highlight those tenets, for all data and computing resources, there needs to be the basic advanced authentication controls with least permissive access. And this goes to the data assets, application services we talked about above. And trust is not automatically granted based on a device being on a network or specific location. The authentication authorization to one resource doesn't mean access is granted automatically to a different resource, so our per session basis. And then policy is the set of access rules based on attributes, which we'll cover a little bit more in later slides. And then for number 5, the enterprise evaluates the security posture of an asset when evaluating a resource request. And number 6, the continual monitoring, and that may force a re-authentication, reauthorization. And then number 7, an enterprise should collect data about asset security posture. And so one of the important pieces there is insight that should be gained by continual evaluation. Of course, that will improve policy creation and enforcement which goes to dynamic policies. So let's go on to the DISA. Let's go on to the DISA reference architecture. And within the DISA reference architecture, it defines 7 pillars that assist with the categorization of the capabilities and technologies that can perform zero trust functions in an environment. And you'll see those in this diagram across the top and in the columns. So there's a group we're involved in, which is the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, which is ATARC. And they have a similar matrix for vendors to categorize the capabilities and products mapped to zero trust pillars. And they're going to be helping vendors do demonstrations to the government around the capabilities matrix with pillars and scenarios and use cases. So there'll be more around that we can share with the FAA. So what is a pillar in this context? It's the area for implementation of the zero trust controls, while the capabilities are the ability to achieve a desired effect under specific standards and conditions. So the importance of this mapping is the flexibility and implementation, the governance, and the maximum visibility and protection of data. So if we look at the pillars, the users, we want to secure access from anything to data, assets, applications, services using identity, credential, and access management. For device, we want to assess every device on every request. On the network, of course, it's critical for control, privilege access, manage the internal and external data flows, and prevent lateral movement. And then under the application and workload, the best practice coding for security at inception, and of course the zero trust decision and enforcement points, which are components of zero trust that we'll discuss later. And the data, achieve data protection through categorization of the data, the schemas, and encrypting the data at rest and transit. Now, if we go on to visibility, we want to detect anomalous behavior, so something that is not normal, and provide the ability to make the dynamic changes, which I mentioned a minute ago, to the policies and make the real-time access decisions. So the continual examination of access control. So in automation, all the pillars are important, but one of the ones that I wanted to call out in particular is around the automation and SOAR and SIEM. So SOAR, the security orchestration and response to improve and decrease response times for security, and the integration with security information and event management. So the automated security response requires the defined processes, consistent security policy enforcement across all environments. And to highlight that a little bit more, needs to provide the proactive command and control, not static. All right. So the DISA reference architecture, it defines some tenets as well. But in this case, the DISA reference architecture with the zero trust security model rethinks how to implement the access to resources and determining the dynamic policy. And that can be behavioral, environmental attributes, but the concept and tenets listed there, the 5, that's supposed to help rethink access to the data, applications, assets, services. So we will sum up. The assume a hostile environment is everything is untrusted. The presumed breach, operate and defend resources with the assumption that an adversary has presence within your environment. And never trust, always verify, which is deny access by default, which we discussed, using the least privilege, multiple attributes, and dynamic policies. And then scrutinize explicitly, so all resources are consistently accessed in a secure manner using multiple attributes that are dynamic and static, and that provides the confidence levels to the resources. And then the applied unified analytics, so that's the continual analysis for the data, application, assets, and services, which include the behavioristics and logs of each transaction. So microsegmentation. So this is the method to create the network segments and control traffic within and between those segments. It provides the ability to control the workloads in a data center or multi-cloud environment with the granular policy controls, and restricts the spread of lateral threats in the data center. So with micro segmentation and the zero trust policy, reduces the audit scope, reduces the attack service, and with micro segmentation, we are discussing the protection of each of the east-west traffic flowing across the workloads that include within or between on-prem and cloud. So it can be private, public, hybrid. One of the analogies I found, which goes to the graphic on this slide, is walking into a bank and we open the door and all the money's right there. But that segmentation. What we're discussing here is opening a vault door, opening another vault door, onto smaller compartments. And so you'll notice an example on this slide is a next generation firewall, which we'll discuss a little bit more. So the network segmentation isn't new. Traditionally, we have the network firewalls, and those network firewalls can have VLAN ACLs with static IPs and subnets. There are some challenges there, but the software-defined micro-segmentation framework also allows the segmentation of workloads and hybrid multi-cloud environments to allow the security posture across the entire network. So it's giving those layers to zero trust that we need to be more secure. And of course, this means defining at a granular level the access to the workloads, applications, and we'll discuss a little bit more on the policies in a future slide. All right, how are we doing on time? Okay. So I wanted to share a little bit about Forrester and Gartner, so that, as well as all the other publications that we were just discussing, so that there can be more discussions internally at FAA and with Red Hat on what we can do to move forward with zero trust proof of concepts, zero trust engagements, and how we can help with the migration to zero trust. So with Forrester, they have a zero trust extended model. And if you'll notice in the center, data's at the core. And so the zero trust framework from Forrester is supposed to enable the direct mapping of technology, purchases, and strategic decisions around the execution of zero trust. And so going around the different components in the model, the network, what does the technology do to enable the principles of network isolation, segmentation, and ultimate security? The data, so the data is at the core. What does the technology do that enables data categorization, schemas, isolation, encryption, and control? And so then we have the workforce and workload. And to keep in mind the time, some of these I may skip over, and I'm going to make sure when we share the presentation that I have the appropriate links in there so you can do more reading. But the ones that I want to call out a little bit more right now is around 5 and 6, the automation, orchestration, and the visibility and analytics. So how does the technology or solution automate and orchestrate the zero trust principles? And does the technology or solution provide useful analytics and data points? So I think all of them important, of course, but automation and visibility spans across all the others. So when we look at the adoption of something like zero trust extended model, along with all of the other publications, they all overlap to some extent. The adoption of ZTX, that assesses existing security program, their zero trust maturity, so the people, skills, technology, capabilities, etc. And then the mapping that output of the assessment to the zero trust extended model to understand where a organization is strong and where they're weak. So that goes to the next one with the analysis of tools and technology to close the gap. So to focus on closing the gaps. And there are some questions that Forrester puts out and talks to vendors about, and that's examining system functionality around micro-segmentation, how a tool or technology helps secure users and limits their access to critical components. How does the system improve visibility into dark corners of the network, and how it addresses cloud networks. So then let's go on to Gartner's Carter model. And their approach is a continuous adaptive risk and trust assessment. So that means use more context, more visibility, more intelligence, continual adaptive risk-based decision-making, rather than a binary, static, allow or block security decisions that have taken place in the past. And so the strategic approach in CARTA that requires some points that they want you to look at. There's the 100% device visibility and automation control, the continuous monitoring, assessment, and remediation, the micro-segmentation, and of course that contains the breaches and limits lateral movement, and technologies and products from multiple vendors. Of course, we're okay if FAA just chooses Red Hat technologies and products, but there's many vendors that come into play when you're dealing with zero trust. Um, New levels of multi-vendor orchestration and process response automation, the discovery, security posture assessment, and remediation. And of course, the effective security management of IoT devices and the physical systems as we grow more and more with IoT devices in the government, we do need that security management. And if you'll notice, Gartner and Forrester, they're close and they're thinking, as you can tell from the bullet points of both. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about components, and then let's go into some use cases for Red Hat products, which can be applied to other products as well. But I wanted to show a couple of use cases, especially if you're already moving forward with OpenShift and containers. So the NIST components call out the policy engine. And you'll notice here the policy engine and the policy administrator, they are within the PDP, the policy decision point. And those are in the control plane and only accessed by the PEP, policy enforcement. But the policy engine of the policy decision point, that's responsible for the ultimate decision to grant access to a resource for a given subject. So the policy engine uses enterprise policy, which we're going to dive into a little bit, as well as external sources as the trust algorithm, the pieces to use to grant, deny, or revoke access to a resource. And the policy engine is paired with the PA. And the policy engine does make and logs the decision, approval or denial, and the policy administrator executes the decision. So the policy administrator, the policy administrator, that's the component responsible for establishing or shutting down the communication between the subject and a resource. And so it is, as I mentioned a minute ago, closely tied to the policy engine and relies on its decision to allow or deny the session. Session is authorized, request authenticated, the policy administrator configures the PEP, the policy enforcement point, to allow the session to start. And of course, the session is denied or a previous approval is countermanded. Remember, it has to be continuous examination. The policy administrator signals to the PEP to shut down the connection. And of course, as I mentioned, all that's done through control plane. The policy enforcement point, this is the system component responsible for enabling, monitoring, and eventually terminating connections between the subject and an enterprise resource. So the PEP is continually communicating with the policy administrator or the policy decision point. So as I mentioned, there's data sources that can be used by the policy engine. And some of those include continuous diagnostic and mitigation, a CDM, industry compliance system, the threat intelligence feed, network and system activity, PKI, ID management, SIM, which is the security information and event management system. And so as we just discussed, there has to be a policy defined in order for the components to make a decision. And what I wanted to do here was show some different um, ways policies have been written and used. And when we talk about the policy enforcement point, there can be different types. There can be a user agent, this client, a network, and an application. So NIST is not as detailed on the standard or the definition of what has to be contained in a rule or a policy. So I wanted to show different types that you can refer to. And the first one on the left, the reason I included that one is the discussion on next generation firewalls and moving from layer 3 rules, IP based, to something like a Kipling method that Palo Alto has in a lot of their documentation on zero trust rule writing. And so this shows the fine-grained or granular policy that allows one resource to talk to another. And with this Kipling method, it's who, what, when, where, why, and how. So as we'll see in future slides, when you're migrating to zero trust or indicating you're going through the zero trust maturity model, you do have to start with that analysis of everything that's taking place on network and applications, because you do have to examine who's accessing what, when, where, so forth. And so one key point, zero trust, there should be no unknown traffic because it is denied by default. And so when we look at this layer 7 policy that's called out on the left box, the process with the policy definition and examining that policy, it reduces the attack surface and it reduces the number of firewall rules enforced by the traditional network firewalls. So then if we move to the middle, the second box highlights another method for fine-grained access control. And there's a book I picked up, and I like some of the content, which is the From Zero Trust Security and Enterprise Guide. And I like the way they define some of the pieces that we go through. And so they have an example of a declarative statement, which is subject, criteria, action, target, condition. And the subjects, of course, can be person or entity. And if we go to the third box, there's a standard called XACML, which is the Extensible Access Control Markup Language. It's XML based. And it was declarative, or is declarative, fine-grained, attribute-based access control policy. And it's a older standard, and it's, if you notice on the top diagram in that third box on the right, it has components similar to the NIST special publication. It calls out an enforcement point, a decision point, the administration point, so forth. So if you'll notice on that third box on the right, on the bottom, it has the XACML specification. And it's really extensive, fine-grained, and it is in some products. And so it's an interesting standard to look at. So let's go into a use case, and I just have a couple that you can take a look at, and you can always ping us back with any additional questions if we don't cover it here. But the book that I just mentioned in the prior slide, this Zero Trust Security and Enterprise Guide, I like the way that they define the service mesh in conjunction with the Zero Trust core components with the PDP and the PEP. So let's go through this a little bit. The service mesh, OpenShift service mesh, provides a uniform way to connect, secure, and monitor microservice applications in the OpenShift environment. So the mesh can be described as a network of microservices that make up applications in the distributed microservice architecture. So the emphasis is on the communication between the microservice, which are the small independent services communicating over well-defined APIs. So if we have people on the call that are familiar with OpenShift, this will make sense with the components of OpenShift Service Mesh. But the mesh features are supposed to be the traffic management, service identity and security, the policy enforcement, and telemetry. So looking at Istio, which is the OpenShift Service Mesh architecture from Zero Trust perspective, the first noteworthy item is the separation between the control plane and data plane with the set of distributed proxies in front of each service. So when you're looking at this diagram, you can see that the proxies can act as the policy enforcement points, and the Istio service is the policy decision point in the control plane. So that provides the core security capabilities. So the service mesh itself has inherited the Zero Trust capabilities. So this is one of the layers for Zero Trust. And the proxies make sure that the service-to-service communication occurs over an MTLS channel, which is the mutual transport layer security for the mutual authentication, and provides the confidentiality in addition to the service consumer and provider authentication. Excuse me. So the Istio security model is based on the declarative policy model, which uses service attributes as subject criteria to determine policies to apply to what services. And the authorization model, the PEP, with the proxies, evaluate the request based on attributes of the requester, the target service, the request metadata, and header information. So note that within the mesh, the requesters and services are addressed by the identifiers and not the IP addresses, because they may be the same in the services. So if we look at the definition of data and control plane, it goes back to the core components for the NIST special publication. So the data plane, a set of proxies running alongside the application containers in a pod, and they intercept and control the inbound and outbound network communication between the microservices and the services. Then the control. All right. Yeah, sorry, the data plane. Making sure I'm not mixing my control and data. So the data plane manages and configures the proxies that make up the data plane, authoritative source for configuration, manages access control usage, and collects the metrics from the proxies. So another use case I just wanted to call out. Sorry, I've been coughing, so I'm using some cough drops. So The key line is something that may get into Rel 9.x. So that project allows the ability to bootstrap and maintain trust on the edge, cloud, and IoT. It is a CNCF project, and it provides highly scalable remote boot assurance and confirmation or attestation and runtime integrity management solution. So it allows the monitoring of remote nodes using crypto root of trust. So the example that I posted here, there's a demo on the Keyline site. I wanted to highlight the knowledge of continuous real-time monitoring state of the devices. And so looking at an etcd cluster in real time, it has the monitoring after a configuration of a hardware root of trust, of course, but it does the monitoring and revocation in real time. So then if we go on to RHEL SSO, the single sign-on. So if we look at the enforcement point for access through the SSO to control gateways, the zero trust principles say we need the consistent enforcement when authorizing access. And the single sign-on technologies like RHEL single sign-on allow the gateways wherever located to enforce single logic and embeds the rule engines for making the enforcement decisions at zero privileges or known roles and often federated to identity stores for authentication. So we can provide the access request GUIs with a consistent presentation look and feel, and provide the housekeeping GUIs to like registration, account, certification, password credentials. So this allows also the collecting of information. So as you can see, this hits the always authenticate and continual examination of authentication and authorization. So if we go to a maturity model, now that we've laid a foundation, we've looked at use cases. So at times, we want to look at some maturity models. So how do you get there with all these different pieces and tenets of zero trust? So what we're doing at Red Hat, we have different security community of practices with special interest groups. And one of them is zero trust working group, special interest groups. And so we're working on different items or deliverables that can be shared with customers. And part of those are including providing the pillared capability and product matrix, zero trust reference architecture, more detail on a zero trust maturity model roadmap. And so a couple of things to note on this diagram are the discovery and assessment portion, the protection level and maturity level, and evolving around the capabilities and controls are to the right. But I want to highlight that the discovery and assessment is very important with the zero trust, since you're adding layers across the baseline, intermediate, and advanced. So identifying data on access and authorization activity within the architecture, Relationships between workloads, network devices, and users must be discovered. And the compliance state, privileged account levels, and validate implementation of existing security controls. So the end state of the zero trust architecture requires the implementation of the security policies tied back to specific authorization attributes and confidence level of the user and entity. So, of course, that maturity level is showing that it's possible to adopt aspects of the zero trust design. It doesn't mean you'll hit all capabilities and controls, but it starts with the discovery and assessment. Okay, so looking at NSA design concepts and use cases, there is a document that NSA put out on embracing zero trust. And I wanted to highlight two things. One is the defining mission outcomes. So defining organization-specific mission requirements tied to the identification of critical data assets, application services. So you've seen DAAS throughout the presentation. Determine who, what needs access to the DAS, so you can create those access control policies. And inspect and log all the traffic before acting. It all goes to the full visibility of all activity and being able to analyze and automate response. And so the diagram that I included here, which you can go back and look at the document, this is trying to show a zero trust remote exploitation scenario where it's not successful in zero trust, but it would have been successful in non-zero trust. And if you look, it's all around the dynamic analytic detection and response. So the trying to make sure going through in order. So looking at the migration and transition that the executive order instructs agencies to put into their migration plan as far as steps, I wanted to highlight those here for reference, which are the identify the actors, identify the assets, key processes and risk, the associated the risk associated with executing processes. So we've talked about all of these a lot already, especially in the maturity model a minute ago, which was around, let's go back to that real quick, all around discovery and assessment. So then, of course, move on to the initial deployment and monitoring right after the identify candidate solution. So it's going through identify, build the policies, identify starting solutions, and then start the initial deployment and monitoring so that you are going through the maturity model. So let's hit just a couple of obstacles. So, so we're getting a little close to time, but the adoption obstacles and challenges, some of those are listed here. There are others, but with any modernization, you do run into challenges and obstacles, and there's different ways to overcome those. It's just a matter of level of effort. And so going through the technical debt, the as I said, the level of effort. So that goes to redesigning coding and redeploying. Um, and then the legacy systems, at times there's not a concept of least privilege or lateral movement with, um, as well as possessing authentication models for dynamic authentication and analysis. Um, so that makes the level of effort difficult there as well. And then there are peer-to-peer technologies. If they're still in existence, they can at times allow privileged lateral movements between systems. And then, like I said, the digital transformation, when they're large deployments, there again, the level of effort can impact the adoption. And additional challenges occur in network hardware and scaling. And like I started out in the abstract, the traditional methods follow Castle and Moat and structure, in which the enterprise is the castle and network security is the moat. So if a user or device is going to have access to enterprise network, the castle, considered trusted and allowed pass security, which is the moat. So the problem with this assumes everything outside the castle um, can be trusted and only threats. I'm sorry. Everything inside the castle is trusted and threats can only come from the outside. So I don't want to go into too much detail on the zero trust network. I thought that, like I put before on an example network provider like Palo Alto, they had a methodology for building a specific zero trust network. And so that can be still similar to what we were talking about for adopting zero trust up above. But they also put it at defining a protect service, the map transaction flows, building the architecture, creating the policies, and then monitoring and maintaining. And it's really going toward the next generation firewall and fine-grained access control with policies. So if we get to the next slide, we want to help with your zero trust journey. And one of the things that I suggest, adding a zero trust SIG to your cybersecurity champions group. Hopefully there's something at FAA around cybersecurity champions and sharing cyber knowledge across groups. And I would have a zero trust SIG that says, how can we adopt zero trust? How can we work with our vendors to provide the solutions and help us with the small portions, not boil the ocean, but start with small portions and build proof of concepts so that you can start the maturity model to go from basic to advanced. So, of course, we are here to help to go through that journey. So, in summary, I would recommend assess and design a plan through a zero trust discovery workshop. Review use cases and the reference architectures. There's a lot of documentation, a lot of publications, more coming out every day, and build those proof of concepts and use a workshop, because the executive order is moving the government to secure the cloud services and implement zero trust architecture. So I wanted to make sure that we could answer any questions. And if we don't get any, if we don't have time now or we can't answer, of course, we'll always ping you back. But I have completed the presentation. So are there any questions?
Kenny, first, great job today. That was excellent. To answer your question, that there are no questions in the Q&A section. However, and we are getting close to time, and I'm seeing people drop off. So with that said, anybody out there that does have any questions, you're thinking about stuff, or maybe questions after reviewing the slides again, always feel free to reach out to me first, and I can get the emails to Kenny or other people that need to be involved for that.
And I'll make sure to get you the presentation at some point today in PDF so that you can send that out.
Yep, exactly. So going on to that point, again, Kenny, thank you so much. I'd also like to thank a few other people for helping us out today. As with most webinars that we've been doing lately, thank you, Catherine and Jeff on the Red Hat account team. They push really hard to get everybody here on time, and to make sure those invites look good. Also, our partners, CDW and DLT, for taking the time to help us out today, as well as hosting our website. With that website, and what Kenny was alluding to, we do PDF the slides. We do post them on the DLT portal. That's the portal you go to request subscriptions. On that page, we also have a link to a YouTube. We do record this video. So again, we did such a great job, shared this video out, let everybody know what a great job Kenny did, or if you missed something, again, everything's on that DLT portal. So that's your go-to place for anything webinar related. Normally this is the spot I plug the next webinar. So with not really plugging a webinar, but something even better for the end of the September normal rotation is Ansible Fest, right? I pasted the link in the chat window. It's a great event. It's the end of September 29th and 30th. I'll steal this from Geico. It's free. So sign up. Even if you can't attend during those days, everything's recorded. You can go back and view recorded sessions. It's a really great resource, and I can't say it enough, it's free. So we're skipping our end of September webinar, so we'll be back in the end of October. We're still working on the topic for that webinar, so stay tuned. Look your email boxes around the beginning of October for that. So with that, myself, the rest of the Red Hat team, thank you for coming out and listening to Kenny today. I talk about Zero Trust, and as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out to myself or Jeff. And again, we'll see you again in late October. Thanks, everyone.